We moved into kind of the relationship part of this class last week. We're talking about friends. And tonight, as you can see from the screen, we're going to talk about bullies, namely cyberbullies. Now, this is a very serious subject, and I want to share with you a few examples. You've heard examples like this on the news. Some really tragic things have happened because of not just bullying, but specifically cyberbullying. It has an even harsher edge to it, if that's possible, than conventional bullying. One example I found concerned a young lady, Jody Plum. She was 15 years old and attended school in Mansfield, England, and she discovered, kind of accidentally, a website dedicated to making fun of her. She didn't even know who made the website. It talked about her weight and even had like a date for her death. And so when she discovered it, she turned it into the school, but they didn't know what to do with it because nobody even knew who it was. So the anonymity added that edge to it, where every day she was interacting with people that she suspected could be the person behind this thing. It was really terrible. But another example is a young man, David Molak, 16-year-old Eagle Scout. He attended high school in Texas, and he'd been receiving text messages from numerous bullies over a long period of time, and they seemed to be motivated by nothing but just plain meanness. And eventually David, he had some other problems in his life, and he felt there was no way out, and he took his own life. And the reason I bring him up is because his brother wrote this, I think, great example about what cyberbullying is after his death. He posted this on social media. In today's age, bullies don't push you into lockers. They don't tell their victims to meet them behind the school's dumpster after class. They cower behind usernames and fake profiles from miles away, constantly berating and abusing good, innocent people. And there are other examples, but they all wind up the same way. A teenager, if he or she survives, is left scarred probably for the rest of their life and trying to figure out what to do and why this happened, and in most cases who even did this to them. So we have to think about that, and it's not just about young people, right? This affects adults as well. Just a few weeks ago, we were at my kids' school orientation. And at the orientation, Mr. Brown, the headmaster of our school, had to say this thing that he's had to add into orientation meetings with parents, which is basically, if you have a problem with one of your teachers, or if you have a problem with the administration or a school or a coach, please talk to them first, see the administration, talk to the school in a real personal conversation before you post something and do a lot of damage on social media. What happens these days is parents get sideways with the school over something their child said, and maybe their child was confused, maybe their child is not being truthful, maybe they are being truthful, but without checking it out, they let their fury go on social media and do tons of damage to the school's reputation. And this doesn't just happen in schools, right? It can happen in churches, it can happen in organizations, shops, retail centers, all kinds of places of employment. And so this is a problem. I have a few statistics that kind of show that it's on the rise. Cyberbullying increased 52% in only 4 years, and you can see the data is a little bit old on this, and you wonder if it's escalated some more. I have some more recent numbers. Cyberbullying incidents tripled in 2014, so it is on the rise. It's continuing to escalate. 1 in 5 middle school students contemplate suicide as a solution to peer cruelty. Now, 1 in 5, that is a significant number. And again, these are middle school students. They're not, older kids, young kids here. In 2017, 14.9% of high school students were cyberbullied over the course of 1 year, according to their records. And again, it's not just the teenagers, but a recent study showed that 40% of adults have experienced some form of online harassment. So used to, the trolls stayed under the bridges and the bullies were just wanting your lunch money, but now it's a more sophisticated profession, if you want to look at it that way. They're using the internet and they're getting good at it to inflict even more harm. And I think if it's possible, cyberbullying is even more dangerous and hurtful than the conventional bullying that most of us grew up with in our childhood. So I want to start by asking a question. Basically the question is, and I want to hear what you have to say if you have anything to share on this. What's wrong with bullying? I mean, why? I think it's obviously wrong, but can we word it? Can we figure out how to say what's wrong with it? Can we put that into some kind of statements? Any ideas? Have you thought about this before?
Putting someone down?
Yeah, we're supposed to be building each other up. You're putting people down. I have a point kind of like that coming up in a minute. What else?
I think it controls perception.
Okay, perception of, they control the perception of.
It's basically a way to control someone else.
Oh, it's controlling, yeah. Controlling behavior. And we often think of that in terms of abuse, like in a marriage, where somebody's controlling. But that's what a bully is. And when you have an abusive partner in a marriage, he is being a bully in an intimate relationship.
You're probably trained on someone's weaknesses, potentially.
Yeah. You're picking a weakness that's usually the move that a bully makes is to find the weakness and go for it.
A lot of times it's hiding an insecurity.
Yeah, which goes along with what Mindy's saying. You find somebody that's weak in a point that you may feel that you're strong in and making yourself feel better by tearing somebody else down. It almost always has to do with insecurities.
It's a violation of the second greatest command.
It sure is. Love your neighbor as yourself. It's not that. It's a direct violation of it. Yeah, go ahead.
So many of the kids have been bullied themselves by parents or siblings, or they come from an abusive situation too, so they haven't been taught or taught in the wrong way.
Right. They're modeling, they're not modeling, they're following behavior they've seen modeled in their home. And they're probably really abused themselves. And it's just self-perpetuating problem. Yeah. Those are all good. And a lot of that's going to be repeated in the list I have. I looked at some Bible passages and sat down and tried to think, what's really wrong with this practice of bullying? Here are some things that I came up with. First of all, bullies see victims as objects instead of human beings, which goes against the value of humanity that God puts in His created beings. The Bible wants us to believe in ourselves. Otherwise, it wouldn't have started out saying that God made us in His own image. We repeat that all the time, but how amazing is that God, among all His creatures, made us in His own image. And then later, I think about passages like John 3:16 and Hebrews 2:9, which says that Jesus tasted death for everyone. To die for someone, that's to put the highest value on that person. I mean, how many people would you die for? Would you die for anybody? And God died for us, which means He believes we're pretty valuable. But bullies see victims as a means to an end. Jason brought up insecurity. Feeling insecure, find somebody weaker than you and pick on that person to make yourself feel stronger. If you're wanting to be the center of attention, find some easy joke to make about somebody who is helpless and can't help themselves and try to get people to laugh at them. Bored, do a little human experimentation. Pick on somebody and see how they respond. When you're acting that way, you're not looking at people as people. You're viewing them as other than you or as less than you. And that's a violation of biblical principles. Secondly, and this has been brought up in your points as well. Bullying is hatred, it's not love. And Tom said the second greatest commandment is love your neighbor as yourself. And the new commandment Christ gave us in John 13:34 and 35 is to love one another as Christ loved us. And we've talked about that love on Sundays as we've been discussing the fruit of the Spirit. Fruit of the Spirit begins with love. And we go on and on and on. Now abide faith, hope, and love. The greatest of these is love. 1 Corinthians 13:13. And he even called us to love our enemies. Matthew chapter 5, verse 44. But when bullies find a victim and abuse them, they're not showing love, they're showing hatred. And there's an interesting passage that I think sheds some light on that activity in Titus. If you want to turn over to Titus chapter 3. I'm going to start, it's one of Paul's lists. He lists a lot of sins sometimes, and this is one of those lists. And you'll notice in verse 3, he talks about those who are, and Malia, this reminds me of what you said, hated by others and hating one another. That's exactly what Malia was describing. They're hated by people, so they turn that hate onto other people. Hated by others and hating one another. Julie and I have this expression, we say, hurt people hurt people. That's what Paul's talking about here. You're hated, so you hate. But if you back up to verse 1 of Titus 3, Paul says, this is how you're supposed to behave. And a lot of this is antithetical to bullying. Remind them to be submissive to rulers and authorities, to be obedient, to be ready for every good work, to speak evil of no one. Bullies have a problem with that one. To avoid quarreling, to be gentle, show perfect courtesy towards all people. How do bullies fulfill that? They come nowhere close to those items. And so that's the second problem. There's a biblical issue here. It's a form of hatred, not love. Here's the third one. Bullies use unkind words to try to exert power over people. And don't let anybody fool you with the sticks and stones riddle. Words are very powerful, and they do hurt. They hurt worse than sticks and stones. The wise man said, death and life are in the power of the tongue. Proverbs chapter 18, verse 21. And, James said the tongue is the strongest member of your body in James chapter 3. And Paul says that our speech ought to be seasoned with salt, always be with grace in Colossians chapter 3, verse 6. So we are supposed to be using our mouths to bless other people, not curse them, but bullies use their tongues as a weapon to inflict damage on people and to exert power over them. It is an abuse of power. That's the fourth thing here. And that doesn't mean they're particularly strong. What they'll do is they'll find somebody they perceive to be weaker than them, and then, as Mackenzie says, try to exert control over them. And the rule they follow is sometimes called the iron rule. Might makes right. If I'm strong enough to take it away from him, then that's mine. If I can get that lunch money, then it's rightfully mine. And that's not the rule that God set forth. That's not at all what the Bible teaches. What does the Bible say the stronger are to do with the weaker? Paul talks about this a lot.
Bear the infirmities of the weak.
That's exactly right. That's Romans 15, right? 14 and 15. We who are strong ought to bear the infirmities of the weak. And then I'm also reminded of Galatians 6:2. Bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. So if you're strong, if you have a strength that's a gift from God to lift people up, not use it to crush them. Again, it's an abuse of power. It's a violation of the golden rule. The iron rule is might makes right. The golden rule, we always kind of summarize it as do unto others as you would have them do unto you. But Jesus said it in Matthew 7:12, whatever you wish others would do to you, do also to them. This is the law and the prophets. I don't know anybody who wants to be bullied. Bullies don't want to be bullied. They don't want to be victims. They want to be the bullies. So you're violating the golden rule. And then, well, that's all on my list. Anybody think of others all of these are violations of biblical precepts. And a lot of you brought these up when I was going around the room a minute ago. It's obviously wrong. And we have to do something about it. Yeah, Sharon.
As far as using unkind words, I think it's much easier to do that when you're cyberbullying rather than face to face. You're
Yeah.
more likely to write something than to say something to somebody's face.
Yeah, you feel anonymity, and sometimes a lot of these cases that I was looking at, they have anonymity. They pretend to be somebody else. They make up a fake name. Or even if you're using your own profile and your own name, behind that screen, and we'll talk about this in a moment at greater detail, when you're behind that screen, you don't feel like you're really engaging with another human being. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself. Let's talk about how to stop it. First of all, if you're the one being bullied, how do you stop being bullied? How do you stop bullies? I think about an episode of the Andy Griffith Show where this bully put a chip on his shoulder and he said, "I dare you to knock this chip off my shoulder." And Opie knocked it off. And he drew a line in the sand. Step across this line. And Opie stepped over the line. So what was he doing?
Calling his bluff.
Calling his bluff. Well, maybe sometimes it's not a bluff, right? So it's better to get licked or to get whatever happens on the internet, to get abused, than to allow yourself to become a victim. Mackenzie brought up, it's a control issue, right? So that's what they want, is control. So how do you stop it? You don't give them control. Because, and this is the only thing you can do. So I'm not trying to be insensitive to people that are having a real problem here and say, oh, this is easy and you can make it go away easily. That's not it. Please don't take that. All I'm saying is you can't have a bully without a victim. You can't have a bully without a victim. So if there's any way that you can be less of a victim or take the victim out of the picture, then you can have some control over the bully. Did you want to say something, Richard?
Yeah, I happened to hear something along these lines today. And the verse that was used doesn't make sense to begin with. Matthew 5:5, blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. And a lot of times we make the mistake of thinking meek means weak.
Mm-hmm.
But I thought this was a good definition of that, is that a meek person carries a sword and knows how to use it, but chooses to keep it sheathed.
Mm-hmm.
And as far as this applies to bullying, like the example you gave from Andy Griffith, sometimes you may know that you're going to come out on the losing end of the deal, but that bully needs to know there's consequences involved with continuing to push you. And sometimes you have to follow through with that and show the consequences of it.
Mm-hmm.
And usually bullies are cowards
Yeah.
to begin with, and when they see that there's going to be some kind of consequences for that behavior, they'll back off.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, Jason.
I think some of it too, in how can I or how does the person being bullied disarm the bully or stop the bully? Part of it's in understanding the value of yourself. Most of the time, the ones that are bullied have a very poor view of themselves anyway. They look down on themselves and they allow others to step on those things. And part of it's, like you started talking about at the beginning, we're made in God's image. We have extreme value, but it's hard to sometimes understand that. But if you can value yourself and not react to what the bully does, let the bully, the taunts, whatever he's doing, understand that he's the weak one in that situation and value yourself. If you don't react, bullies are looking for reactions. They want, it's a part of the control thing, and if you can learn not to react and understand, I'm a child of God, I'm a good person, then it makes it a little bit easier to deflect some of that. And part of that with children is the parents devalue their kids. The parents, we don't do a great job of building our kids up. We're quick to tear them down. I mean, how easy is it to get onto your kids for something, and how hard is it to compliment them when they do well? So part of the job is our job to increase value in our children's mind. You don't want to blow them out of proportion and make them think that they walk on water. But if you're disciplining and correcting a lot more than you're building up and complimenting, you're contributing to that bullying that's going to happen to that child.
Yeah, and as we get older, we can do this better, but you reminded me of something. We should exercise our choice in who's going to assign value. Are we going to let God assign value, or this bully, or this nameless, faceless entity on the internet in the case of cyberbullying? We can choose, but it's harder for young people, exceedingly harder. Now, Jesus is a great example, because who was bullied more than Jesus? But do you look at Jesus as a victim? He was bullied, I mean, in the worst possible way, but he did some amazing things when he was under that pressure. What was one of the tactics that he used when he was on trial? He didn't answer their questions. And Isaiah predicted this in Isaiah 53, sheep silent before his shearers. And Pilate got so mad. In Matthew 27, he said, do you not realize how many things they testify against you? But Jesus gave him not an answer, not even to a single charge, so that the governor was greatly amazed. Maybe amazed doesn't mean frustrated. Maybe he was impressed by Jesus. I think that he was. And then the same kind of reaction from the high priest. Jesus wouldn't give a defense of himself. The high priest was trying to get him to blaspheme, is what he wanted. And when Jesus wouldn't answer, he had one of his men strike Jesus across the face. He had him, well, if verbal abuse doesn't do it, we'll go to physical abuse. And so Jesus was doing something. Peter says when he was reviled, he did not revile in return. So that's a case where you could be turned into a bully, and Jesus could have been the biggest bully in the world. He told Peter, I've got 12 legions of angels. But he knew his strength. Kind of like both of y'all were saying. He knew his strength. I've heard meekness defined also, Richard, as strength under control. And compared to, a horse and a bridled horse. That horse is powerful, but that small bridle is controlling it. So if you are the victim and nobody's coming to your aid, there's only, to my mind, a few things that you can do. I think if you're younger and you have resources, you should tell somebody. And then when I talked to the teenagers about this, I talked about tell your parents, tell somebody what's going on, tell a trusted individual, don't be ashamed of it. But as we get older, we have to try to not allow people to control us and turn us into a victim. But a lot of times we're the bystander. And I want to talk about this too before our time is up. What can I do to stop it? Maybe I'm not the one being bullied. I'm not the victim. Maybe I can see it. What can I do to stop it? And the first thing is learn how to identify it. And I saw a couple of things as I was researching for this that defines what bullying is. And one is an acronym, and this is real useful for your kids. If you're trying to tell them what to watch out for at school or online, just use the acronym CAP. Number one, bullying is repeated, cruel behavior. Not cool behavior, cruel behavior. And notice repeated. If somebody does something one time, that's not what we're talking about here with bullying. It's definitely wrong, but we're talking about a habitual problem, something that's continuous and ongoing, a perpetual problem. Bullying is never accidental. It is intentional for reasons, that we've been talking about, to try to gain control, to feed an insecurity, whatever. And then the P means it's a power imbalance. It's usually somebody who's strong in one area picking on a person who's weak in a complementary area. Everybody has their strengths and weaknesses. That's something else we can talk to our kids about. Maybe you're not great at sports, but you're great at this. And I remember as a kid, my parents having those kinds of conversations with me, and I just roll my eyes. And but it does stick. It does stick, and we have to reinforce that and tell them about their values and enhance their strengths. But usually it's a power imbalance, and the target, the victim, can't hold his own and needs help. And so when you see this going on, repeated cruel behavior, intentional behavior, and a power imbalance, it's time to step in and try to help. Do something about it. We got to know what to look for. And then when it comes to cyberbullying, it's a little bit different. And here are some of the things that make it especially harmful. Cyberbullying in particular is, first of all, persistent because digital devices don't stop when the school bell rings, or when you go home from work. You can't get away from a cyberbully without putting your technology away, and you may need that, and it's your right to be able to have that and enjoy that and use that as a tool. And so that's one thing. Also, it's permanent a lot of times. Most of the information communicated electronically is permanent and doesn't come down. And some of these cases I was reading about, the problem was long after it was addressed, put air quotes around that, by the school authorities or whatever, the stuff that was hurtful stayed online. The fake web pages that nobody knew who built them, they stayed up. And, the death date for this girl stayed up online. So that's another thing that's unique to cyberbullying. And it's also hard to notice for parents and teachers. Do victims of bullying often talk about it? Not until it's late or too late. Often they keep it in themselves because they feel ashamed. They shouldn't, but they feel ashamed. And by the time it gets out, it's too late to repair or to stop the damage. And this, when it's online, a lot of times we don't know where to look. We don't know where it's happening. Ironically, our kids may actually be hiding it from us because they're ashamed of it. So it's an exceedingly sinister practice, cyberbullying is. So one of the things we need to do is recognize it, be able to identify it. Here's the second thing. How can I stop it? Number 2, develop empathy for others. I wanted to get into this a minute ago, I think on Sharon's comment. What is empathy? I'm glad we brought this up. Nobody knows.
It's your ability to put yourself in someone else's shoes.
Yeah.
To identify with them.
Yeah, to feel what others are feeling. And, I often hear it distinguished from sympathy. Well, sympathy is when you feel with somebody, and empathy is when you feel what the other person's feeling. It's practically the same thing, right? I know there's a slight difference. I think people who can empathize have often actually been there. Say somebody who's lost a spouse can help the other person in a way that one who has not been through that can't. But when we're talking about this, it's just we're talking about knowing that we're dealing with people here. And if you're a person who has a problem with this, being maybe just overly critical on social media or trolling or, just getting into these arguments online, if you tend to do that and you want to fight back, and realize that when all of that language is mediated by a screen and you're looking at pixels and bits and lights and things, you're tempted not to see the person behind the screen. There's a real living, breathing human being on the other end of that conversation. If we would just remember that one thing, I'm talking to a real person. I'm hurting a real person. Everything would change. I don't know if it fits in here, but I read a story last week about a father whose son was being bullied at school. And he went to confront the bully, who was just another kid. And instead of chewing him out or whatever, which is what he felt like doing, he asked him to tell him what was going on at home. And he found out this kid, of course, had a terrible home life. Malia was pointing out these kinds of things. And he needed some clothes. And the father of the kid being bullied, he bought this guy dinner, sat down, and then he bought the guy some clothes. And he tried a different approach. And it allowed the kid to see that he's dealing with human beings. Human beings. I remember one time I was getting bullied. I know it's hard to believe. I haven't always been this big and strong and powerful, but when I was a kid, going through an awkward phase, I was getting bullied by this guy. And my dad and his dad set up a time for us to get together and play, which sounded like a terrible idea for me. But the bully's dad, he said, "Okay, guys, get together. I want y'all to give each other a big hug," which I hated, and he didn't like it either. But we hugged each other, and we became really good friends after that. And so that's kind of developing empathy and understanding there's human beings on either side of this. Yeah, Mark.
I'm not minimizing what you're talking about,
Yeah.
but I'm seeing a coarsening. The kids that grew up, that started doing, people fell into this. The ones that, when phones came along, adults or teenagers just realized it was a device that they could do this kind of thing. The ones that grew up with it now that are starting to come into being, it's coarsening. They're doing it in real life now. I read a story about 3 teenage girls decided they didn't like this boy, and they told, he was a lifeguard at a pool up in Pittsburgh, I think it was.
I read this story, yeah.
And they told them that he sexually abused one of them, and they got together, and then another one said he did it to me in school and stuff. It's going beyond it now because they're seeing it, they grew up with it happening online and stuff, and now it's just getting to the point where people are going beyond, they don't care anymore, they've gotten so hard from all this, that it's coming back around the other way, that they're getting in it in real life, doing things that you wouldn't even imagine doing to somebody.
Right, and you're not minimizing what I'm saying, you're making my point. I throw these examples out as unusual examples, not the standard. This is the kind of thing I'm talking about. I like the word you use, coarsening, is the opposite of empathy. If we want to stop this, we've got to teach our kids empathy. We've got to learn empathy ourselves. You don't falsely accuse somebody of sexual abuse, for example, unless you don't really see that person as a human being. And you don't look on down the road and see what kind of things you're going to ruin for that person potentially for the rest of his life.
The shooting at the Jewish synagogue, it's coming out of the electronic age now. All this backbiting and bullying online when you don't see anybody. And now they're not seeing anybody in real life. They're coming out and shooting people over stuff like this.
It's like a flight simulator for bullying. You go online, you learn how to desensitize yourself, and then you go out in the real world and you don't see people as people any longer. Yeah. One last thing, and then maybe I'll have time to make some more comments here. Turn it around. Just if you want to stop it, use somebody after class last week said, there are some good things that we can do with social media, and that's exactly right. And there are friends that I have that use social media every day to encourage people. It's a really great way to encourage people. So you see a lot of darkness on there, be a light on there. Try to encourage people. Don't get engaged and try to smooth out some awful conversations going on, some thread that just shouldn't exist. But start positive messages, and you can see people actually feel better and attitudes change from that kind of thing. There are things that we can do, and it is a big problem, and there will be other opportunities to talk about it as we go on. But I appreciate your participation, everything you had to say tonight. It's a good discussion.